Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. Content warning. The episode you're about to listen to covers a Nancy Drew original text story. These books were written from the 1930s to 1950s, a time that was culturally very different. Within some of these original stories, there are sometimes references to alcohol, smoking, and racist depictions. Listening discretion is advised. Hey guys, and welcome back to True Drew Podcast. I hope you guys are having a good month so far. We're only a week away from Christmas, which is just like, I don't know where the time has gone. I hope you guys have had the chance to indulge in some hot chocolate, watch your favorite Christmas movies, or do whatever holiday-related activities you like to do best. So the episode that I have prepared for you guys today has been a long time in the making, but I remember months ago talking to you guys on my Instagram, True Drew Podcast, about the original Nancy Drew texts versus the revised texts, because up to this point we've been talking about the revised books. Now, as most of you know, but if you don't, I'll catch you up to speed, the first 34 books in the Nancy Drew series, from The Secret of the Old Clock up to The Hidden Window Mystery, all of those books have original texts. They were 25 chapters versus the 20 chapters that we normally see in the revised. But that is only one key difference. So a lot of differences in these texts have to do with cultural things. The books were revised starting in 1959, and a lot of times they took out outdated language, racial stereotypes. They took out a lot of different things for different reasons, but in doing so, it majorly changed some of the plots for some of these books. And as you all know, if you've listened to any of the other episodes on the books, the revised text, they didn't necessarily take out every racial stereotype because they're still prevalent within the revised texts. But it's so interesting to me how I'm for the revisions. I'm glad that they revised what they did revise, but it's also kind of interesting because it did take a lot of detail out of, the book. And I mean, you're omitting like 5 whole chapters, so it's taking out quite a bit. So I guess it's been several months ago now, but I actually went to a local bookstore and I was able to find, I believe, the first 12 or 13 books, the Applewood editions of the Nancy Drew books, which came out in the 1990s. They were reprints of the original 30s texts. So that's kind of what inspired me to start researching the original texts and getting a hold of all 34 so we could cover them here on the podcast. I also just wanted to give a quick shout out to Lexi. Thank you so much. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't have been able to find the original text version of The Whispering Statue. She was so kind and found that for me and sent it to me, and just wanted to say thank you so much. Now, with all of that being said, I want to be really upfront about this. There's actually some forewords in some of the Applewood books that I have that basically say what I'm about to say, but in reading these original texts, there are some very outdated racial stereotypes, and there are some very anti-feminist ideas that some characters may hold. There's just different things. These books were originally written in the 1930s during the Great Depression. It was just an entirely different world back then. Not saying it was okay, but there will be some things that really date these texts. My hope for these episodes that cover the original text is that we can acknowledge them for what they are. We can accept that these were written in 1930, nearly 100 years ago, when things were very much different. And in doing so, we don't sugarcoat the things that are hard to talk about. We're going to talk about these issues in the least offensive way possible. And we can also talk about the good things that come with the original text, because in reading the revised and now reading the originals, I am actually on book number 4 right now, The Mystery of Lilac Inn. I can say that if you can not exactly ignore some of those issues, if you can take it with a grain of salt, The original texts are so rich in detail. All that being said, I will continue to put content warnings in the descriptions for podcast episodes because there may be some things that are, still offensive, even when I have tried to water them down a little bit for the podcast. But I just wanted to make that known before we started the episode. Another quick note, I have decided to omit the cover ratings and funny cover spoofs because we've already done those for these books if you go back to the earlier episodes of the podcast, because we talk about the different covers over the years. And I've actually omitted the add that to your resume section of the episode for these original text episodes because we would pretty much be just rehashing the same things that we've talked about in earlier episodes. So really, the point of these episodes is going to be to compare the revised text, the plot, to the original text's plot. All right, I think that about covers everything. So now let's jump into discussing The Secret of the Old Clock original text. So, as stated before, this is book number 1 in the Nancy Drew series, and it first came out in 1930. So next we'll go ahead and discuss the characters, and what's been so interesting to me in reading the original texts, sometimes the names of people have changed. I wasn't really expecting that. I was expecting maybe whole characters to be omitted or characters to be added. But it's interesting to me why certain people's names have changed. Like, I don't really see the reason for it. But so first up, we have Josiah Crowley, who is the guy who just recently passed away in the book, and he has supposedly left a second will somewhere. We have Henry Rolstead, who was a man who wrote the will for Josiah Crowley. We still have Richard, Cora, Ada, and Isabel Topham. We also still have William and Fred Matthews, who are 2 brothers who Josiah supposedly left some of his inheritance to. There is Abigail Rowan. She's still same name, same character. There are Matilda and Edna Turner, the Turner sisters, but they no longer have a young ward named Judy, which was kind of interesting. The most significant changes that I could see to the characters in The Secret of the Old Clock between the revised and the original is that Allie and Grace Hoover are now Allie and Grace Horner. I don't know why, but they changed the last name. It's little details like that I'm just like, I wish I knew why they did that. And there has been a whole addition of another character named Jeff Tucker, who is apparently the Topham's bungalow caretaker, and this is their bungalow that's on Moon Lake. Just to give a little bit of a heads up, Jeff Tucker is a character that is African American, and unfortunately some of the racial stereotypes that we see in this book are involving him. And really quickly, I'll go ahead and read a brief synopsis just to get you back into what this book is about. Nancy Drew is suspicious that Josiah Crowley left a second will. It also helps that she can't stand the Tophams, who are set to inherit his fortune. In this book, she sets out to find that second will and help a lot of people in the process. So now let's jump into the fun part where we discuss the direct quotes and notes that I took down for The Secret of the Old Clock original text. So right off the bat, this book starts off very differently than the revised text. In the revised book, we start off with Nancy saving this little girl named Judy, who lives with the Turner sisters, from falling off a bridge. She gets scared by this moving van that runs by and she falls off the bridge. Now, the original book, we start with Nancy and Carson talking at home. So we get a feel for Nancy and Carson's relationship on the very first page. So, as I said a little bit earlier in the episode, I'm actually on the 4th book of the original texts right now. So I have gotten sort of a feel for what they're like. I've read a few and gotten some under my belt. But it's interesting to me how in the revisions, we see Nancy saving children a lot of times from drowning, from falling off bridges, from basically getting themselves into dangerous situations. And like I said, I haven't read all of the original texts yet, so there may be some times where Nancy saves children in other books, but it's very interesting to me. I wonder why this choice was made. Was it to make Nancy seem more maternal, more of a hero? Is it because these are technically quote-unquote children's books and we need to have more children within the books? It's just a fascinating decision to me, and I wish I know why it was made. This will probably come up the more we talk about these original texts. And another thing is, in the revisions, it's very obvious, like, Harriet, I feel like, tried to make Nancy more domestic, and I think that's why Harriet and Mildred Wirt Benson butted heads a lot of times. Like, there's actually a foreword in my Applewood edition book, The Mystery at Lilac Inn, where Mildred talks about this, and she says, yeah, once Edward Stratmeyer passed away, the people in charge, which I guess means Harriet, wanted to change Nancy to be a little less bold, a little less upfront and in your face. So I'm sure we'll talk about this some more. It's just super fascinating to me. The next note that I took down has to do with Nancy's appearance, and it says Nancy is described as being 16 years old and having a curly golden bob. So we've talked about this in other episodes of the podcast, but Nancy was originally blonde and wasn't Titian or strawberry blonde until later books. But Nancy was also 16 in the original text versus the 18 that we see in the revisions. A lot of people cite her age change as having to do with the driving age, being 18. But, I think it also probably has a little bit to do with some of the adventures that we see Nancy go on. It seems more feasible for someone who is 18 versus 16. It's not that big of an age difference, but it does make a difference, I think, in the perception of the reader. I love the next note that I wrote down. I just said, Nancy speaks her mind. And this is one thing that I had always heard from other people when I was covering the revisions on the podcast. I would get messages from people and they'd say, oh, you need to read the original text. Nancy speaks her mind. She doesn't mince words, whereas in the revisions, she's very polite. And when people would tell me that, I would instantly think of the final scene, that Nancy Drew computer game, because Nancy is sassy. She has comebacks, and I was like, okay, I'm ready for it. That sounds awesome. We love a strong female main character. So the first instance that we get of Nancy speaking her mind, she's talking about the Tophams and Josiah Crowley passing away, and she says, folks said he died just to be rid of their everlasting nagging. Ooh, burn. Tell them how you really feel, Nancy. So it's safe to say she does not like the Tophams. But Nancy takes this even further, so we get some descriptions of what she thinks of the individual members of the Topham family, and Nancy calls Richard Topham a skinflint, Cora a social climber, and Ada and Isabel the most stuck-up creatures she's seen in her whole life. The next thing that I took note of is Josiah's wife apparently died from the flu and he was lonely. And I think this was in the revised book too, but Carson also says that Josiah tried to say some last words to his doctor, but no one understood him. And Nancy swears that it had to have been about a second will. Now, this next note made me really, really sad. So, from this first interaction that I got of Nancy and Hannah Gruen, their relationship seems so different in the original texts. So, in the revised books, we see Hannah Gruen being very motherly to Nancy. She's always worried, Nancy, be careful when you're going out here and solving these mysteries. She gives Nancy hugs. She's just like a grandmother type of figure. So in these original texts, at least the books that I've read so far, it's more of a business type relationship, like Hannah is referred to as a servant, and it's more of a Nancy and Carson are the employers over her relationship. Here's a direct quote that I wrote down. It said, although only 16, Nancy was unusually capable, and under her skillful direction, everything ran smoothly in the Drew household. While that quote makes Nancy seem very strong and independent and capable, it also made me so sad. I was just like, we're not going to have any fireside chats with Hannah in the original books, I'm afraid, or at least from what I can tell so far. It's very much like Nancy will say, hey, Hannah, can you do this? Or hey, Hannah, you can take today off. It's just, it's so weird. I don't know if I like that. I think I like Nancy and Hannah's relationship in the revisions way better, at least from what I can tell so far. So the next note that I have written down has to do with Helen Corning. Helen Corning is mentioned in the book, and we get some backstory on Nancy and Ada and Isabel's falling out. So in the revisions, it just says Nancy doesn't like Ada and Isabel, and it doesn't really say why. But in the original text, it says Nancy had caught Ada doing something she shouldn't be doing, and then they tried to blame Nancy for it. So it says Helen and 2 others defended Nancy, and I wondered if it was Bess and George or just 2 other random classmates. So if you've read the revised text, you remember the scene where Ada and Isabel make this department store worker's life like miserable, but we have the same scene in the original text of Ada and Isabel being difficult at the department store, but Nancy does not mince words here. So I'm pretty sure in the revised text, Nancy says she pities anybody who has to marry Ada and Isabel. In the original text, the book just says she found them stupid and arrogant. Like, dang, Nancy. But while Nancy is at the department store, we do get a description of what she buys. She selects a party frock of blue crepe, but Ada and Isabel don't rip the dress in this version, which I found kind of interesting. In the revised book, they try on a dress and they rip it and they make a big deal out of it, and they tell the department store worker, like, we're not going to pay for this, you'll have to pay for it, and Nancy steps up and does something about it. But it's interesting why they changed this. These are the things that I'm talking about. There's so much rich detail in the original text. There's just better descriptions. Like, Mildred Wirt Benson was a fantastic writer, and while the revisions are good, I just get more of a sense of Nancy's personality in the originals. So the next thing that I took note of while reading is Nancy delivers some papers for her father, and in the revised book it says she takes a recently constructed highway. In the original book, it says, as she rode along the gravel road, her eyes traveled to the fields on either side of the highway. Like a true daughter of the Midwest, Nancy Drew took pride in the fertility of her state and saw beauty in a crop of waving green corn. Do you see what I mean? Like, so much detail. Like, why was that taken out? Like, it's great. It's beautiful to read. I wish that some of this stuff could have been kept in the books. Another great clue that we get here is it says that Nancy is a true daughter of the Midwest. So the state that Nancy lives in and where River Heights is has been highly contested by people for years. And people are always like, oh, maybe she lived here, or, because in the books, she's able to get to New York and Chicago within a few hours. So corn is big in Indiana, Ohio, Iowa, Missouri, and I think there's strong arguments for these places because Nancy goes to Chicago a lot. Mildred Wirt Benson was from Iowa. I'll have to watch for more clues as I read these books. So the book also says that Nancy is driving her classic blue roadster, which I never get tired of reading that. I love that is Nancy's car. This next note is just kind of funny, but one interesting thing that I noticed, and I guess this is Mildred's doing, the book says Nancy Drew a lot. Like, Nancy Drew did this, Nancy Drew did that, instead of just Nancy, like the revised would do. And it may be because this is the first book, we're trying to establish Nancy Drew as the main character, but I just thought that was kind of funny. So it's while Nancy is driving along on this little road that a storm comes up, and Nancy drives into a barn to get dry because, of course, she's in her roadster convertible, but the reaction of Allie Horner is funny. So she's perfectly calm and she just says, "You got in just in time." But in the revised book, she screams, as she should. I mean, a car just drove into the barn you're in. The next note that I took down is Ada Topham doesn't rip a dress at the department store, but she does knock over a vase and she tries to blame it on a salesgirl. So Nancy steps in when this happens and saves the day. And it's after this that Nancy overhears Ada and Isabel talking in the park about how they're worried about a second will being found. So that is the same as the revision. This next note has to do with some 1930s slang that I had never heard of, but Carson warns Nancy that if she finds another will, she'll be in the Topham's wool. And I guess that's like being in their hair? I don't know. Must be a place you don't want to be. So I know when we talked about the revised book for the podcast, I talked about the fact that Nancy kind of comes off as this great savior. She's always trying to help these people who are less fortunate, which isn't a bad thing. It just kind of rubbed me the wrong way. But in the original text, there's a lot of talk about the Depression. And when the Horner sisters talk about struggling to make ends meet, it made me really sad. It was just the way the book describes like their threadbare clothing and they don't have much food in their fridge. It's just, it's sad. Maybe the revised book rubbed me the wrong way because there wasn't that proper setup. It was just like Nancy's jumping in to help people, and maybe they don't really want her help or they don't need her help. Like, with this book, I feel like they really set it up and you feel sorry for the characters. It's just the descriptions are so good. And I don't know, I couldn't help but read myself into this book. I mean, the economy right now compared to the 1930s, although not exactly the same, does have some similarities. The rising prices of groceries, etc. And I think it was so sweet how Nancy hired Grace to make her a dress in the original text because she's a seamstress. It's like Nancy knows that the Horner sisters will not accept charity, so she goes about it this roundabout way, like, oh, well, I've been needing a new dress, maybe you can help me by making me one. So, a little side note, but my great-grandmother, whose name was Daisy, she sewed all of her own clothes, and she sewed all of her clothes for her 3 daughters, my grandmother and my aunts, and in the book, Allie says Grace hasn't had a new dress in 3 years. And I actually own the first dress that my great-grandmother bought for herself in the 1960s. It was a huge deal because she had always sewn her own clothes up to that point. And she was a single mom and, had to take care of her kids. But I will treasure that dress always. I don't know, that just really hit home for me. So, in the revised version of Secret of the Old Clock, Nancy meets the Turner sisters and Judy first. And in the original, Nancy meets the Horner sisters first. And like I mentioned earlier, Judy isn't even in this book, which is kind of funny. So, the next note that I took down, Nancy visits Abigail Rowan and goes and gets her $10 worth of groceries because, like the revised, she doesn't have much in her pantry. And $10 in today's age would be $187.55. Wow. So when Nancy is talking to Abigail Rowan, who apparently has a touch of dementia or memory problems, Abigail gets excited when the clock chimes and starts talking about this notebook that Josiah wrote in. But as we're talking about this, the book mentions that Nancy studied psychology in school, and it talks about how sometimes music or sounds can profoundly affect memories, which is kind of cool. So it's at this point in the mystery when Helen comes by and she's trying to sell charity tickets, and Nancy takes them off her hands as an excuse to go to the Topham's house, which is very similar to the revised. Unlike the revised edition, we get an extensive description of the house. So Nancy says there are a bunch of sundials and statues in the yard and oriental rugs inside that clash with the drapes. It basically just seems like a very gaudy house. So Mrs. Topham and Ada and Isabel are like talking down to Nancy like, we don't want to buy your charity tickets. But then Mr. Topham swoops in and buys the tickets, not to support the charity, but so their name will be in the paper. Wow. No wonder people hate this family. So this next note I thought was very funny, but Carson tells Nancy she needs a vacation for managing the house. I mean, she manages Hannah, but Hannah's the one that's technically doing everything. But anyways, Nancy goes to Moon Lake and Camp Avondale to see Helen, and Helen asks how long Nancy will stay, and she says, until you get tired of me. Okay, so here's where we get to some of the problematic parts of this book, but Nancy and Helen go ride a boat around Moon Lake, and it's mentioned that the Tophams have a, forgive me, Negro caretaker at their bungalow named Jeff Tucker. But if you think this is bad, just wait. It will get worse later on in the episode. So the next thing that I wrote down is Nancy's day at Camp Avondale sounds fun. Nancy awakes to the fragrant odor of pines, has a good breakfast, and enjoys some tennis, swimming, and water polo. So it's after this that Nancy goes out in the boat and it stops. The engine just completely dies, and Nancy says, hateful thing, I believe it stopped on purpose. So she's finally able to fix it, but since she's on Moon Lake, it made me think of the game Ghost Dogs of Moon Lake, and I really wanted her to say, I need some torque. So the next thing that I wrote down is the details are, again, very rich in this book, but Nancy finally gets to the Topham's bungalow, and it's funny because she's trying to shake Helen and doesn't want to tell her what she's doing because apparently, Helen's kind of gossipy, but she sees where the bungalow has been ransacked. And in the revised, the burglars take things from the Turner sisters in a bit of foreshadowing, but this is the first mentioning we get of robberies in the book, and it's almost halfway through the book. But this next part sent chills down my spine. So the book says, for some reason, she was unable to free herself entirely from the feeling that an unseen danger lurked in wait for her. The very walls seemed to smirk and grimace at her, and there was an ominous something in the air. Spooky. So it's while Nancy is checking out the bungalow and she's seeing that it's been ransacked that the robbers find her hiding in the closet, but she puts up way more of a fight than she does in the revised book. Nancy kicks and claws at them, but she's eventually found by the caretaker in the closet. She's found by Jeff Tucker as she's about to get out with the closet rod. So actually I do believe there was a caretaker in the revised book. He may or may not have been named Jeff Tucker. I don't remember if he had the same name, but his race was not specified like it is in the original text. So this next part of the book is bad, and I apologize for this, but Jeff Tucker, the caretaker, speaks in a very stereotypical African American dialect, like how a white author in the 30s would have written them to sound. So it's just bad. An example of this, the book says that Jeff Tucker says, "Oh, you is a caged lion this time." And to make it even worse, Jeff Tucker is apparently also drunk, and the book describes it as an alcoholic glitter in his eyes. This, in and of itself, is wild to me because, the Nancy Drew books are technically kids' books. And I had noticed this when I read The Clue of the Broken Locket. They talk about the adults imbibing in alcoholic drinks and smoking, and so it's just interesting to me. So next, Jeff Tucker says to Nancy, "Say, white girl, tell me where all this here furniture is at." And Jeff also says he's tired of being a caretaker. And I said, I can't say I blame him. I wouldn't want to work for the Tophams either. I will say this, though. Nancy Drew does have some quips on her, though, because Jeff says he's sowed all his wild oats, but still sows a little rye now and then. And Nancy says, "Yes, Jeff, I can smell that on your breath right now." I did laugh a little bit at that comeback of Nancy's, but what happened to Jeff is terrible because basically one of the people that robbed the Tophams bungalow took advantage of him. They took him out for a drink, it says, and then he wakes up at a hotel without his clothes on, and his key to the Tophams bungalow is gone. This is just horrifying to me, the implications of this. He woke up in a hotel room without his clothes on. What happened? This is just disturbing. I mean, what else do you think they're implying there? I mean, it sounds like they're implying that he was raped or abused or something. It does not sound good. Either way, if it was to humiliate him, it's bad. And of course he's drunk, so he doesn't really remember accurately what happened, but why would that detail be there? His clothes were off, and he's at this hotel room. It sounds so horrible. Maybe I'm reading into it, but it doesn't sound good. So Nancy and Jeff go to tell the police about the robbery, and it says she puts on the throttle. So usually in the revised books, we see Nancy going as fast as the speed allows. Not so in the original texts. She drives really, really fast. And Jeff says the roadster can sure step, which means go really fast. But he also asks what will happen if it turns turtle or flips. Jeff also gives Nancy a warning when she's going through the city of Melbourne. He says, "You better watch out because the marshal is persnickety." And Nancy asks if he got in trouble for speeding, and he says, "No, just for enjoying myself." I thought that was kind of funny. Jeff does have a good sense of humor. So once Nancy is talking to the police and they go to chase the robbers, they just leave Jeff in town, which I thought was really rude. But the police follow Nancy, and when they get to a fork in the road, Nancy goes left and the police go right. And Nancy picked the left road because it goes to a larger town, which seems pretty logical. She thinks, oh, well, the robbers are going to go there. There's more people where they can, offload the furniture to and sell it really quick. and she asks a man in a horse and a buggy that she passes if he's seen a moving truck, and he says it tried to push him off the road. So Nancy knows that she's chosen the right direction, that the robbers did come this way. So she ends up at the Black Horse Inn, which is a seedy establishment, and sees the three robbers having a drinking orgy. So that is how the book refers to it, a drinking orgy. Not my words, that's the book's words. So Nancy goes in this barn out back, and she unlocks the robber's van, and she finds the clock. And then there's this tense moment where Nancy hides in a trough under a blanket, and the robbers drive off drunk. They drive off drunk, and Nancy opens the clock and finds Josiah's notebook. After this, Nancy catches up to the cops, and they chase after the robbers, and the cops say, "Don't fire unless it's necessary, but if they resist, pepper 'em." Like, excuse me, what? This sounds like a 1930s gangster movie. They're just like, spray them with bullets. And so the robbers fire at the cops, and then they shoot out their tires. So next, Nancy gives the marshal a ride back to town, and she's afraid that he'll discover the clock that she has in her back seat, because she's technically not supposed to have it. She took it from the stolen items that were in the robber's van, and technically that's moralistically like a little bit questionable, but he doesn't see it. And he also recognizes Nancy as Carson's daughter when she gives her name, and he says, "Following in your father's footsteps, a little young, aren't you?" Also, it's morally. I don't know what I'm doing today. So when Nancy finally gets a second, she reads Josiah's will and list of stocks and figures it's about $300,000, which is roughly $5.5 million today. And Carson says he's proud of Nancy and she's a regular detective. So it's at this time in the book that everyone gets together to read the will, and Grace and Allie each get $75,000 apiece. Abigail Rowan gets $75,000, and the Turners and Matthews each get $20,000 apiece. And the Tophams go bankrupt. And then Nancy, of course, doesn't take any money as a reward, but she does take the clock as a reward. So that is the end of my notes for the original text for The Secret of the Old Clock, but I did keep the What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen segment for the podcast because I thought it would be interesting to see, like, if the mentionings of food from the 1930s are that different from the revised text. So some of the things that we saw Hannah Gruen cook in this book, she made tea and cake, fruit, fried eggs, crisp bacon, and hot cornbread, and waffles. So now let's talk about some of the things I liked and the things I didn't like about the original text for The Secret of the Old Clock. I have to say that the things I liked about the original text for this book, there's so much more detail. It's just so fun to read. There's, like, I feel like I'm in the 1930s, and there's some of that I don't like, and there's some of that I like. It's just so much more there to pull from. So the things I didn't like about the original text for this book, I didn't like how Jeff Tucker was treated. I don't know if that's what they were hinting at. It's just horrible. They describe him as talking like he's unintelligent. I just don't like that. I just think they depicted him in a very terrible way. And I didn't like that he was taken advantage of by the robbers. And speaking of the robbers, the fact that they drove drunk, like, it's not just bad enough that they stole people's furniture, they drive drunk. So I did think it would be interesting to compare what I gave the revised text rating-wise versus the original. And for the revised text of Secret of the Old Clock, I gave it 2 magnifying glasses. And the original text, I give it 5 magnifying glasses. This book was above and beyond, if we take the cultural insensitivities out of it, is a better book. It's just got better descriptions. The characters are described in so much more detail, and the plot is just, I felt like it was a better plot. So if I had to pit each book against each other and pick which book I like better, I kind of favor the original text. I feel like we get so much more of Nancy's personality. It is unfortunate that we get a bunch of other things and poor depictions of other characters, but overall, this book is just better to me. So that concludes today's episode, talking in depth about the Secret of the Old Clock original text from 1930. So for next week's episode, we're going to be discussing the original text of the Hidden Staircase. Until next time, thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at truedrewpodcast.